Thomas was a millionaire. He had everything he wanted and had never heard a no in his life. His parents had passed away and left him several companies, lands and plantations spanning thousands of hectares. Despite owning all of this, he did not make the serious decisions. He left that to a group of investors. Thomas didn't want the trouble of thinking and managing all the businesses. He had other people to do that. However, his actions were constantly in the news for being reckless, disrespectful to people, and even humiliating. Because of all this, he began to incur financial losses, as many people stopped buying products made by his companies. In a meeting with his partners, the atmosphere was tense. They knew they needed to make a decision to reverse the situation. Thomas, we need to act quickly. Our sales are plummeting, and the company's image is getting worse, said Carlos, one of the oldest partners, looking directly at Thomas. Thomas, with an indifferent expression, replied while fiddling with his phone. I don't see why this is my problem. You guys are paid to solve these things. The partners exchanged worried glances at Thomas's response. Julia, one of the youngest and most determined partners, tried a different approach. Thomas, what if you publicly apologized? That could improve our image with the public, as she suggested with cautious hope. Thomas looked up from his phone and snorted. Apologize? Are you crazy? I would never stoop to that level. The frustration was visible on the partners' faces. Pedro, trying to be pragmatic, proposed an alternative. We have another idea. We could donate a small portion of the harvest and open popular restaurants that would serve free food to needy people, Pedro suggested. Thomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued for the first time. Interesting. That would make people praise me, right? Exactly, confirmed Pedro. It would be a commendable action, and you wouldn't lose much, just a small part of the profit, which wouldn't even make a difference in your life. Thomas laughed a dry, humorless laugh. You really think I'm going to give up any profit, no matter how small? You're dreaming. My answer is no. The discussion intensified, with the partners trying to find ways to convince Thomas. They knew that if nothing was done, the financial losses would continue to grow. Thomas, I need to intervene again, said Julia, trying a new approach. Our reputation is at stake here. If people continue to see us as a company that doesn't care about the public, it will be dangerous in the long run. A reputation doesn't pay the bills, retorted Thomas, visibly irritated. The partners exchanged glances, knowing they needed to find a solution that would please Thomas without further compromising the company. The meeting continued with heated proposals and debates, trying to find a middle ground that could save the company's image without hurting Thomas's pride and greed. What happens with the part of the harvest that isn't good, that's spoiled or not fresh? Thomas asked. His partners said it was used as compost, as it wasn't good for consumption. At that moment, Thomas smiled and said they could make the free restaurants but should use only that part of the harvest. This way, he wouldn't lose any of his profit and at the same time, would appear as a good and charitable man to everyone. Let's use the harvest that would be discarded. It's perfect, said Thomas with a gleam in his eye. This way we save money and are still seen as heroes. The partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Julia was the first to speak. Thomas, that would make the food taste awful. Plus, it could be harmful to the health of some people, especially children and the elderly. That's true, added Pedro. Using spoiled food is a huge risk. We insist that you use a small portion of the fresh, consumable harvest. The impact on your profit would be insignificant. Thomas, however, didn't listen. You don't understand, he said decisively. This is not a negotiation. Do as I ordered. The partners' discomfort was palpable, but they knew arguing with Thomas was pointless. Reluctantly, they agreed to follow his instructions. In the following months, several free restaurants were built. As expected, due to being free, enormous lines of homeless and humble people formed. I hope this works, murmured Carlos as he watched the inauguration of the first restaurant. The meals were terrible. The cooks did what they could to make them more palatable, but the quality of the ingredients didn't help. It's like trying to turn stone into bread, lamented one of the chefs. Even so, every day, huge lines formed. People who had nothing to eat preferred that to going hungry. It's not the best, but at least it's something, said Maria, one of the regular attendees, holding a plate of thin soup. In the end, Thomas got what he wanted. Reports were made about his charitable work, showing him as a generous man concerned about the needy. The public's perception of him began to change. He really cares, said a journalist during an interview. Some complaints were made about the quality of the food served in the restaurants, but Thomas always used his power to keep it from coming to light. We are doing our best with the resources we have, he said in response to the accusations, always with a convincing smile. Being considered a good and charitable man, the products manufactured by his companies began to sell more. It's impressive how public perception can change with a simple act of charity, commented one of the partners during a meeting. And so, Thomas managed to increase his profits even more without spending anything on the food for the free restaurants, since it was food that would be thrown away. In the end, everyone wins, he thought, satisfied. The partners, though still uncomfortable with the situation, found themselves without options. He got what he wanted, said Julia, resigned. Life went on with Thomas being exalted by the media and the public, while the lines at the restaurants continued to grow. For many, bad food was better than nothing. At least we have something in our stomachs, the patrons would say. Everything was going according to plan, and Thomas was happier than ever, feeling very clever. At 50 years old, he started worrying about whom he would leave all his fortune to, as he had no children, wife, or living relatives. Despite wanting an heir, Thomas didn't want to marry or commit to anyone. He wanted to continue living the life he always had, free and without anyone. A year had passed when he met a woman at a luxury party. Lucy was working as a waitress, serving drinks and snacks to the guests. Thomas was struck by her beauty. To him, she was the most beautiful woman in the entire place. "You are the most stunning sight I have ever seen," Thomas said to Lucy as she served him a glass of champagne. Lucy smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir, I'm flattered." From that day on, they began to see each other frequently. Lucy fell in love with Thomas. Like him, she had no living relatives or children. So, Thomas invited her to live with him in his mansion. "Do you really want me to move into your house?" he asked Lucy, surprised by the sudden invitation. "Yes," replied Thomas with a confident smile. "I want you to always be by my side." She was impressed by how quickly he asked. For a few months, they lived happily. But finally, Thomas's much-desired heir was about to appear. Lucy was pregnant, and both were overjoyed. "Thomas, I have incredible news for you," said Lucy, her eyes shining with joy. "I'm pregnant." Thomas hugged Lucy, feeling a happiness he had never experienced before. "That's wonderful. We're going to have a child, an heir to everything I've built." However, as Lucy's pregnancy progressed, her appearance changed. Her skin was no longer the same, and she had gained a lot of weight. Because of this, Thomas lost interest in her. "You're different," Thomas commented more to himself than to Lucy, observing her from a distance. Lucy, sensitive to Thomas's changes, tried to ignore the growing distance. "Thomas, is something wrong? I feel like you're distant." "Yeah, I'm just busy with business," he replied coldly, avoiding eye contact. Since she was pregnant with his child, he couldn't kick her out of the house just yet. Lucy noticed he was becoming more distant, didn't talk to her much, and came home smelling of different perfume almost every day. "Thomas, why do you smell like women's perfume?" Lucy confronted him one night, her voice filled with pain and distrust. "It's none of your business," Thomas retorted irritably. "You're imagining things." She argued with him, but the discussions went nowhere. One day, Lucy couldn't take it anymore and decided to leave. "Yeah, I'm leaving, Thomas," said Lucy, with tears in her eyes. "I can't live like this anymore." Thomas looked at her indifferently. "Do whatever you want. You've always been free to choose." Lucy left the mansion, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. As she walked away, Thomas felt a mix of relief and emptiness, unable to deal with the consequences of his own actions. Lucy returned to her home, carrying with her the hope of a different future. Despite the pain, she knew she needed to think about her child's well-being and seek a healthier environment to raise him. Thomas, on the other hand, continued to live his life the same way, not realizing that his quest for an heir had cost him his only chance at true happiness. Thomas thought that, due to his money and mansion, Lucy would never leave him. He did everything to get her back, but nothing worked. He sent flowers, expensive gifts, and even letters apologizing. "Please, Lucy, come back home," he wrote in one of the letters. "We need to raise our child together." However, towards the end of her pregnancy, Lucy returned to Thomas's house. Lucy didn't look well, she appeared tired, was in severe pain, and felt very ill. Thomas grew worried and decided to take Lucy to the hospital. "Are you okay?" Thomas asked, concerned, as he helped her into the car.
No, Thomas.
"I'm in a lot of pain," Lucy replied weakly. At the hospital, the doctors said they needed to perform the delivery urgently, as both mother and baby were at risk. "We need to act quickly," said the doctor. "Both the mother and baby are in danger." Thomas was anxious, waiting in the waiting room. After a few hours, the doctor returned with a grave expression. "What happened, doctor?" Thomas asked, anxious. "Unfortunately, Lucy didn't make it," the doctor said with sadness. Thomas was deeply shaken. "And the baby, how is my son?" "Your son has been moved to the ICU and will be under observation for a few days. His condition is critical, but we're doing everything we can," the doctor replied. Thomas felt a mix of sadness and hope. He visited his son every day in the ICU, watching him through the glass. "You will survive, my son," Thomas murmured, holding back tears. As days went by, his son was discharged from the hospital and finally allowed to go home. The doctors said it was too early to make any definitive statements, but he would likely have some lasting effects. "He might have developmental difficulties, but only time will tell," one of the doctors explained. This left Thomas even more distressed, as he wanted a healthy heir to take over his businesses when he retired. But with no other options, he welcomed his son and named him John. "Welcome home, John," Thomas said, holding his son in his arms. As time went on, it became evident that John had some difficulties. He couldn't walk or speak yet. This infuriated Thomas, as the child took up so much of his time, even with the help of nannies. "Why isn't he improving?" Thomas asked, frustrated, while watching John play on the floor. "He needs time and special care, sir," one of the nannies explained patiently. Thomas could no longer go out for fun and rarely attended business meetings. In a fit of anger, he fired the nannies. "I'll take care of him myself," Thomas declared with a determined expression. "I don't need you." The nannies were shocked but could do nothing. "If you need help, sir, we're available," they said before leaving. Thomas started taking care of John on his own. As he drove, he thought about what to do. The press was unaware of John's existence, Lucy was deceased, and he had no relatives, just like John. Only the nannies knew about the boy, but they had already been fired. "Where will I take him?" Thomas thought aloud as he drove aimlessly. "What should I do?" He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw John playing with a stuffed toy, oblivious to his father's distress. Thomas felt a wave of guilt but also growing anger at his situation. "I just wanted a healthy heir," Thomas said with tears in his eyes. Why did everything go so wrong? As he drove, he realized he needed to make a decision that would change his and John's lives forever. Thomas didn't want to risk having John discovered by someone in the future, so Thomas wouldn't leave John in an orphanage. As he drove, he didn't know what to do until, passing through a wooded area, he saw an old abandoned cabin. He got out of the car, took his son, who was just watching, and wheeled him to the front of the cabin. "Come on, John, this is your new home," Thomas said with a coldness he didn't even recognize. John, unable to fully understand what was happening, looked at his father with innocent, confused eyes. Thomas, saying nothing more, returned to the car, leaving John alone. He knew what would happen to his son but felt no remorse. "It's for the best," Thomas murmured to himself, trying to justify his actions as he drove back home. Thomas returned home and felt relieved to finally be free, going to sleep without realizing the horror he had just caused. Meanwhile, poor John was alone in the forest. He tried to move the wheelchair but was too weak to do so. He was scared but still couldn't speak. John cried silently for hours, hoping his father would come back, but he never did. The days and nights in the forest were long and lonely for John. Hunger and cold became his constant companions. The sound of animals around him frightened him, and the darkness was relentless. The old cabin offered no comfort, only the harsh reality of his abandonment. Thomas never returned to that place and didn't even think about doing so. Several years passed, and Thomas was richer than ever. His public image was better than ever. He had remarried but was now widowed. However, he had a daughter named Eileen, who helped him with his businesses and showed great potential. "You are everything to me, Eileen," Thomas frequently said. "I will leave all my businesses in your hands." Thomas was over 60 years old and would soon retire, leaving his daughter in charge of his businesses. He loved being the father of a healthy and capable daughter. It was a huge pride for him. One day, while at home, Thomas received a call from his daughter. "Daddy, we need to talk urgently," Eileen said, her voice trembling with concern. "What happened, Eileen?" Thomas asked, feeling a pang of anxiety. "One of the partners has been cooking the company's books, and now we have $1 million debt. We need to fix this immediately," she explained desperately. After meeting with his daughter and his partners, Thomas made a difficult decision. "I will sell all my shares to you, Eileen," he said calmly. "Use the money to pay off the debt." Eileen was surprised but also touched by the trust her father placed in her. "Thank you, Daddy. I will do my best to save the company." "I know you will," Thomas replied with a tired but proud smile. The sale was completed quickly, and Eileen used all the money she had to pay off the debt. Thomas knew he was leaving the company in capable and determined hands. He felt that he could finally rest, knowing that his daughter would carry on his legacy. As he worked to stabilize the company, Thomas reflected on the choices he had made in his life. He was a successful man, but the ghosts of his past, especially the decision to abandon John, haunted his quiet moments. However, he clung to the idea that everything he had done was to ensure a secure and prosperous future for Eileen. And so Thomas prepared for his retirement, surrounded by the success he had always sought, but with a heart that deep down knew that some scars would never heal. Thomas felt relieved that his daughter was so smart and discovered the problem quickly. He slept peacefully, knowing that everything was in good hands. "She's brilliant," Thomas thought before falling asleep, feeling secure and proud. The next day, Thomas was unable to enter his company, as security stopped him. "Sorry, sir, but we can't let you in," one of the security guards said firmly. "But I am the owner of this company," Thomas exclaimed, incredulous. "We have direct orders from Miss Eileen," the guard explained. She had told him over the phone that she was the one who had cooked the books so that he would sell his shares to her. "Eileen, what's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling with anger and confusion. "Dad, I'm the one who manipulated the accounts. I needed you to sell your shares to me," Eileen said coldly. "Now the company is mine." Thomas was left with nothing. He trusted his daughter, who had taken everything he had. He couldn't even enter his own home anymore, as it now belonged to Eileen. "You can't do this to me, Eileen. I'm your father," Thomas shouted, desperate. He tried everything to contact his daughter, but she no longer answered his calls. With no options left, Thomas spent the day in a park, crying and having nowhere to go. How could this happen? He whispered to himself, tears streaming down his face. I did everything for her. He didn't understand where he had gone wrong with his daughter. He had always raised her with great care, hoping she would be his successor in the company. Night fell, and he slept in the park, alone and in the cold. The days passed, and hunger overtook his pride. Thomas began to beg for alms and also went from store to store asking for work, but for a 70-year-old man, it was extremely difficult. Sorry, sir, but we don't have any openings at the moment, was the most common response he received. Wandering aimlessly, he found one of the free restaurants he had once set up. The food was terrible. Even though he was hungry, he couldn't eat it all, but it was enough to satisfy his hunger. This is all that's left for me, he thought as he pushed the plate of food away. Thomas slept on the streets, living off scraps and suffering greatly. The hours he spent in the cold on the streets made him reflect. I am paying for my sins, he murmured as he shivered from the cold. I abandoned my son, just as Aline abandoned me. He realized he was paying for his sins, which were not few. However, time could not be reversed, and he had no way to make amends with his son, who had likely died alone, cold and hungry, just as he was now. John, Thomas whispered, tears streaming down his wrinkled face, forgive me. Each night spent in the open air led Thomas to reflect more on his past actions. He remembered the moment he left John in the forest without any remorse. At the time, I was so blinded by my greed, he told himself, feeling a pang in his heart. The memories haunted him, and he finally understood the extent of his cruelty. Thomas, once a powerful and respected man, was now merely a shadow of what he had been. He saw the cruel irony of fate. Those restaurants he had created to clean up his image were now his only means of survival. This is justice, Thomas thought, resigned. I'm finally getting what I deserve. He tried in vain to find a way to contact Aline, hoping that maybe he could at least explain his remorse, but all his attempts failed. She had cut him out of her life completely, just as he had done with John. As time passed, Thomas's health began to deteriorate. The cold, hunger, and lack of medical care took their toll. Yet, he continued to live on scraps, trying to survive day by day. Each day is a punishment, Thomas reflected, but it's a punishment I deserve. Thus, Thomas lived without a home, without family, and with the certainty that his past had finally caught up with him. The only thing left was regret, but now it was too late for redemption. He had to live with the consequences of his actions, alone and helpless, in the same situation he had imposed on his son. Thomas then smiled and laughed. He didn't know if he was going crazy, but he felt a sense of happiness for paying for his sins and suffering, just as he had made his son John suffer. Finally, fate has caught up with me, Thomas murmured to himself, the irony of his situation not escaping him. Thomas experienced kindness from only two people during this phase of his life, Anna and William. They were grandmother and grandson and had a busy little cafe. Good morning, Mr. Thomas, William greeted, handing Thomas a sandwich and a drink almost every day. Thomas was very grateful and happy for what they did for him. Thank you, William. You and your grandmother are the only light in my life now, he said sincerely. One day, Thomas was crying, but not for what he was going through, and rather for what he had done. William, who was making his morning run, saw the old man sad and approached him. Mr. Thomas, is everything okay? William asked with concern in his eyes. Thomas looked at him, tears running down his face. No, William, it's not. I'm paying for all my sins. I've done horrible things in the past, and now I'm reaping what I've sown. William sat down beside Thomas. Do you want to tell me more about it? He asked gently. Thomas poured out his heart. He didn't go into many details but said he had done horrible things and was paying for everything he had done. William looked at him and simply said that yes, he knew Thomas was paying for everything. I understand more than you might think, William said. I also had a difficult childhood. I was left alone in the forest by my father. I couldn't walk or talk. I spent the night in the cold, crying. Thomas looked up, shocked. How did you survive? The next day, I was starving and had no more tears to cry, William continued. I started crawling using my arms. I was about to faint when Anna found me and helped me. Thomas remained silent, absorbing every word. Anna lived in a nearby tent and often visited the area looking for fruit to eat. She helped me and took me to her home. She raised me as her own child and never abandoned me, despite all the difficulties and not knowing my real name. She called me William, he said with a sad smile. Thomas felt a wave of recognition and pain. John murmured. Over time, I started to stand up, even though I fell several times. Anna always encouraged me. I didn't give up. Even though it was late, I began to speak a few words. It was difficult, but her love gave me the strength to continue. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face again. She saved your life, he said, his voice choked with emotion. Yes, she gave me a second chance, William replied. And that's why I decided to take care of her when she grew old. She always told me that no matter what happens, we should always help others. Anna and John often went to the free restaurant that Thomas had set up. The food was terrible, but they had no other choice. This food is hard to swallow, Anna would say, pushing the plate aside. By the time he grew up, John could walk and talk perfectly. He didn't know why it happened, but to him, it was a miracle that the love of his adoptive mother had brought into his life. I never would have managed without you, Mom, John often said. Your love was my cure. Because he had to eat that terrible food from the free restaurant, John tried to create more flavorful dishes at home whenever he could. This led him to learn how to make various tasty and inexpensive dishes, snacks, and desserts. Let's try something different today, John would say, experimenting with new recipes in Anna's small kitchen. With a little money he had, he began selling what he made, and everyone loved it. These sweets are delicious, customers would comment. He managed to save enough money and set up a small cafe, where Anna also helped him. I can't believe we made it, Mom, John exclaimed on the day of the opening. I'm so proud of you, my son, Anna replied, moved. Thomas was silent, but couldn't stop crying. He could never have imagined that William was actually John. How is this possible? Thomas murmured, wiping away his tears. John continued, saying he never forgot him. Even though I was young, your face always appeared in my dreams, dreams that were nightmares, John confessed. To this day, I have nightmares about that day. Thomas lowered his head, feeling the weight of his actions. I never wanted anything from you, just distance, John continued. However, Anna, my adoptive mother, said that forgiveness was divine and that we should at least try. She is a wise woman, Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. That's why I used to give you food every day, so I could try to forgive my own father, John explained. Thomas embraced John, who, even though he didn't seem to want it, embraced his father as well. Thank you for this chance, son, Thomas whispered. Shall we have lunch together today? John invited with a faint smile. I want you to know more about my life. Thomas, John, and Anna spent the afternoon talking. Thomas recounted how he ended up on the streets and the deceit he suffered from his daughter. She completely deceived me, Thomas said, shaking his head in disbelief. John showed no signs of pity for his father but treated him kindly. You made your choices, Dad. Now you're reaping the consequences. Thomas then said he would make amends. As my son, you are entitled to half of the company. I don't want anything from you. If I receive anything, I will give all my share to you. Thomas remained silent, absorbing his son's words. I'm glad you're doing well, he finally said, with a melancholic smile. Anna, who had been watching the two men, had her heart filled with hope and gratitude. This is just the beginning, she thought, emotional. You can stay here with us, Dad, John offered. I don't have much, but it's a safe place. Thomas nodded, feeling a warmth in his heart that he hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you, son. Perhaps we can build something together, without repeating the mistakes of the past." The following days were marked by a new routine. Thomas helped at the cafe, learning from John and Anna about the simplicity and beauty of life that he had ignored for so long. He was determined to show that he was worthy of the forgiveness his son had given him. "I will make amends, even if it takes the rest of my life," Thomas promised himself. Thomas's journey of redemption was just beginning, but with the strength of love and forgiveness, he believed he could finally find peace. Thomas said he was going to leave the house as he found a way to make amends. Before leaving, Thomas spoke alone with Anna and asked for the phone to call an old friend. "I need to sort some things out, Anna. Could you give me the phone to call an old friend, a lawyer?" Thomas asked with a serious look. "Of course, Thomas. Here it is," Anna said, handing him a piece of paper with a number written on it. The next day, Thomas's friend, who was a lawyer, arrived at John's house and explained the situation. "Hello, I'm a lawyer and a long-time friend of your father," the lawyer said upon arriving. "Thomas asked me to file a lawsuit so that you can receive your rightful share in the companies." John looked at the lawyer, surprised. "But I already told my father that I don't want it. In return, I will give everything to him." The lawyer nodded. "I understand, but he insists that you're entitled to it, and as his lawyer, I'll receive a portion of the money for my services. So, it's a good deal for me." On the day of the hearing, Thomas and his two children, Eileen and John, were present. The atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. DNA tests confirmed that John was Thomas's son and that, by right, he was entitled to half of all the companies Thomas owned at the time, as it was also proven that his daughter had deceived Thomas in bad faith. "The results are clear," declared the judge. "John is legally Thomas's son and is entitled to half of the companies." Eileen looked down. Avoiding the gaze of her father and brother, Eileen murmured to herself, feeling the weight of her actions. "I just wanted control." However, Thomas secretly left the courthouse, and John searched everywhere. "Dad! Dad!" John shouted, desperately looking for Thomas in the streets near the courthouse. Days passed, and John couldn't find his father. John now had a fortune in his hands, but all he wanted was to give it to his father. "I don't understand why he left," John told Anna, frustrated. "All I wanted was to give this to him." Months later, John received a letter at his home. It was a letter from Thomas. "A Dear John, I may never be forgiven for what I did, even if I gave all the money in the world, but all of this is yours by right." John felt a lump in his throat as he read the letter. Thomas continued. "Yeah, I don't know if I will see you again soon, as I feel you are better off without me. I only want to see you again when I have forgiven myself for what I did to you. Don't worry about me, I'm fine, living a simple life. Perhaps one day our paths will cross again." As John read the letter, tears streamed down his face. "Dad," he whispered. Thomas was in the distance, hidden among the shadows of a tree, watching his son with a sad smile on his face. He knew he had done the right thing by giving John what was rightfully his, but the weight of his past actions still kept him away. John cherished the letter, feeling a mix of sadness and hope. "I will find you, Dad," he promised himself, "and I will show that we can start over." From that day on, John decided to use his fortune to help others. Following Anna's teachings, he opened more cafes to employ those in need and donated large sums to charities. Every action he took was a tribute to the sacrifice and love he had received from Anna and, in a way, an attempt to show his father that forgiveness was possible. Thomas, living his simple life, felt a growing peace knowing his son was doing good. "Maybe one day when I feel worthy, I can return," he thought. And so life went on. John, with a heart full of determination, continued his mission to do good, while Thomas, from afar, watched with pride and hope, waiting for the day he could finally make a complete redemption and reunite with his son.